All right. Hi, Marisol. Good afternoon.
Good
Uh,
afternoon.
Thank you for agreeing to do this with me. So I plan today to just take about 15 minutes to have a conversation with you about equity and distance learning. And the reason I invited you to do this is that, of course, this new context that we're in has brought just lots of questions to my mind, lots of concerns, lots of worries as I think about the differences and opportunities for our students. So I put together some questions and some ponderings, and I thought we would just take 15 minutes to explore those together. I'm recording this because I think some of the things that you and I are thinking about will be of interest to other people, and I hope that this conversation will lead people to do further exploration as they think about equity for students in Oregon, particularly under this particular context, but also looking forward to the future when we'll be back in a physical schoolhouse. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. Thank you for the
Okay.
invite. I always enjoy talking with you, so this will be fun.
Likewise. So this is my little introduction. So for people who access this recording and they just happen to find the slide deck, they can see what we are doing and why we're doing it. And here is the equity lens that you developed through the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I use this to kind of frame our conversation because these are really great questions for me to be asking as a director of special education and for all of us to be asking ourselves and one another as we're thinking about services to students. All right, and my computer is going to want to do some updates. So the first question from the equity lens is who does it impact? As we're thinking about strategies to support distance learning for all, one of my questions for you and I to explore is, what should we understand about how the current context impacts students and families? And part of the impetus of this question for me was a conversation I had at the state level with special education directors as we were talking about supporting our families and moving in the world of special education towards providing specially designed instruction. And one of the things that was shared is, the wider context that includes Native Americans in our state who have experienced genocide through disease. I've been reflecting a lot on that because it's not just about, being sheltering in place or staying home and not being able to get our haircut, but actually the potential that this situation is reactivating cultural trauma for some of our students and our families. And I'm curious what are some of your thoughts about that? What are some things that I need to be thinking about as I think about making sure to, making sure that we're supporting our families where they are?
So the question, who does it impact? You know, I think it's important to separate this question from the second question that addresses who has opportunities and who does not. So let's
Yeah.
just take the first question. If you take a look at the national picture, who is it impacting?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the group that's been impacted more significantly than any other group has been the Black African American community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you think about the national picture and you look at New York City's ground zero, like Latinos make up about 34% of known deaths from coronavirus, which is higher than their, like 29%
Mm-hmm.
of city population reflection. There are two small Native American pueblos in New Mexico that had higher infection rates than any US county as of 2 Fridays ago. That's significant.
Yeah.
Why is that happening? And then, like I said, Blacks have been hit nationally. I saw something that came out from the Associated Press. They did an analysis and they said that, of the available death data, and that's a whole other question, like data and getting access to that.
Yeah.
But they found that Black people actually were, the number of people who actually were victims of the coronavirus were 42% of those that they had known had the virus. And that's double their share of the population in the states that were included in this analysis. So they're doubling disproportionately the number of people who've been impacted. That's pretty significant data.
Yeah.
And it's clear that nationally communities of color have been more significantly impacted.
Mm-hmm.
In Oregon, though, on April the 8th, there was Oregon Live did an article, and they said the headline was Oregon's Latino population disproportionately hit hard by coronavirus
Yeah.
cases.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's who's getting impacted. Let's be real clear about that. Yes, absolutely. Communities of color are more significantly impacted than our white communities are.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the response of the first question.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's interesting what's happening specifically in Oregon. I know more about what's going on in Oregon than I do, of course, nationally, because I've had opportunities to speak with colleagues and friends from communities of color. You know, it's interesting. The results that we have in Oregon, of the 687 people, I'm looking at the article right now, of the 687 people who were tested and found positive, where race is known, 29% are Latino.
Oh, wow.
That's a huge number. So in Oregon, we're seeing significant numbers of Latinos being impacted from coronavirus. So of course, the next question is why? Why are communities of color so significantly impacted? Some of the responses have been, well, they're coming from poor communities. Poor is poor. But there's a significant difference between the impact that white poverty has and the conditions that they experience versus the conditions that are experienced by communities of color who are poor. A colleague of mine gave me a great example this morning when he said, the difference for him is, if you are white and you don't have work, you can apply for benefits. But if you come from, if your documentation and your status is questionable in this country, then you're not going to go and apply. You have to work. So these communities of color are in dire straits. They have no parachute whatsoever economically. They're really having to go ahead and work. And that means they're the ones who you're going to see in the fields, the migrants, working along with a ton of other migrants in close proximity to one another, working, and don't really have the ability to distance as some of the rest of us do, who have economic privilege or other kinds of privilege. So that's, you know, a big part of why they're so significantly impacted. And it was interesting because some of the things that are coming out of the state, even from the governor's office, it was interesting. One of the people who spokespeople for her the other day when she was sharing the data said that people don't want to disclose. They don't, you know, families from mixed households don't really want to visit a doctor because, you know, they hear stories about the colossal medical bills or the fear that their personal information is going to be giving out to governmental organizations or agencies. And so there's an elevated fear around this that impacts communities of color. So, you know, that could account for some of the reasons why we're seeing such significant impacts in communities of color with the disease.
Yeah, people have concerns about how their data could be shared based on historic experiences around those impacts. And I think that you know, one of the things that, you know, we're focused on right now in the special education world, you know, the theme is care, connection, and continuity. And so we're reaching out to families and offering supports, and our families are responding in lots and lots of different ways based on their contexts. And we are really trying to make sure that we understand and are supporting families in the best way that we can. And, you know, making sure that we're returning to the most fundamental things. And, you know, some of the fears and concerns that many of our families have go beyond, you know, whether or not their child is receiving exactly 20 minutes of language therapy a week. You know, not that that's not very important, but you know, I appreciate you sharing some of that information. I'll put the Oregon Live article link there's a document that has all the links and resources. And I linked here to a couple articles about the racial disparities of COVID-19 and also the impacts to Native Americans. So, the next question is that who has opportunities and who has not. You kind of referred to that. And, I'm thinking about how does the current context impact opportunities for our students. Many of our special educators are grieving, not only the different opportunities that this situation presents within their districts, but sometimes within their own household between students who are impacted in different ways by disability versus students who are not experiencing disabilities. And, in a conversation I was having with educators, my immediate thought was, opportunity gaps have always been present. It's just that, this current context for some of us, it's shined a brighter light on these existing inequities that maybe some of us have not had chosen to have the same visibility of. So I'm just kind of curious what your thought is about that particular aspect of it,
Yeah, that's a really excellent point, Kathy. I mean, when I read that, I thought that's exactly what's going on. It's interesting because, I was reading some of the responses from Abram Kendi, who's the director of an anti-racist and research policy group that many of us are familiar with his work at the ESD. We're reading some of his books. But he said it really well. He goes, America is facing a racial pandemic within the viral pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that clearly captures that well, and sadly, the picture just keeps looking worse and worse by day. And he has an interesting article. I'll make sure you get the link to that one as well.
Okay.
But yeah, see, this is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Americans have been arguing about this since the beginning of the Republic. Why do racial disparities exist? Why is it that students with disabilities continue to be marginalized? Why? We've had these questions for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Around the race issue, because racism exists in this country and has historically, what happens? So you have long systems and institutions in place that are designed to exclude and marginalize certain groups. So that has led to, and we know that's led to things like redlining, right?
Mm-hmm.
So guess what? When you look at it in the current context, that means people of color have fewer housing options. That's pushing people of color into certain areas. And I can tell you a story that's local, personal, and immediate. It's a housing complex here in Oregon, just outside of Portland, that many communities of color live in because the rents are good.
Mm-hmm.
And they have 3-bedroom apartments, and people they need the number of bedrooms. So the agency that runs these apartment complexes actually put a limit on the number of people that you can have in one apartment at a time, and that's 14 people.
Mm-hmm.
I sit here from my lens, from a very middle class lens, and I think 14 people in a 3-bedroom apartment, holy moly, that's a lot of people. I can't imagine it. So there must be more people living there. So getting back to the whole social distancing thing, redlining leads to fewer housing opportunities, pushing communities of color into certain areas so they can't distance.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Access to fewer resources. That's just one example of how racism historically has led to where we are today and why America is in fact facing a racial pandemic within the viral pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, it's easy to say, markets, right? Communities of color live in areas where they can't get access to fresh foods. We know that.
Yeah.
That leads to health issues, hypertension, diabetes, okay? Yeah. And so this is the thing with the coronavirus. People who are dying have what we're calling other underlying health issues.
Yeah.
What is diabetes? What is hypertension?
Yeah.
So the impact on communities of color is high. Yeah, those are just some of the examples that I see. So there really is, all the systemic and institutional fallout from racism in America historically is in fact a contributing factor to the pandemic's impact on communities of color.
Mm-hmm.
I want to send you another link. It's a 2019 analysis by the Associated Press that highlights so much of what we're talking about right now.
Thank you. When you were talking about redlining, I was just writing myself some notes. I was thinking also, that impacts, where people are living and potentially, you talked about, their access to resources like, uh, nutrition and things like that, and, the air quality. And then also, for a lot of families, their connectivity, their ability to connect to the,
Right. And
to the
educational,
internet.
yeah, access to educational resources, So many of our communities of color just don't have access. You raise a good point to computers,
Yeah.
right? Again, that Associated Press study talked about 17% of students nationwide lack access to computers at home, right?
Yeah.
So that is definitely another fallout from the impacts of economic oppression as well as racial oppression.
Yeah, we're finding, getting devices to students is, for us in our contacts at the ESD for students we serve is not the major problem other than some technical issues. It's really online access. That's a barrier in addition to the other things that are
And
going on.
a question to you, Kathy, is can you tell me a little bit about what teachers right now are doing to address that? I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, yeah. So they prepared packets for students to, in the meantime, while we're getting devices and hotspots out to them. Hotspots are back ordered. Every school district in the nation is trying to get those set up for families. And so there are a lot of phone calls and conversations with parents and at least checking in, finding out how they're doing, giving them ideas and support and focusing on basic needs, making sure that, people have their needs met and getting devices set up, lots of work around that and making sure that they have what they need and they're set up and, deploying the few hotspots that we have available to them so they can start getting connected. We don't have everybody connected yet, but we're getting there. We don't have all of our staff connected even yet. So that's how complicated it is. It's really, like I said, it's really shining a light on these things because these differences have always existed, and your ability to be able to access the internet easily and inexpensively is, a necessity, for a lot of things, and, access to a lot of things, including education, and that barrier has existed for a long time. So the next question was whose voices are at the table, and one of the things that we've been watching happen is a number of decisions having to be made statewide. The timeline went from schools were closing for 1 or 2 weeks to closing for 6 weeks to closing to the end of the year. And not all of us are at that table hearing, what's happening and how those decisions are being made. We're just responding and implementing them. But this is an important question is, who is at the table, and do we have representation from educators in rural areas? Do we have individuals with disabilities and special educators present? These are things people wonder about. And then how are people of color centered in the conversations? And, these aren't questions that you and I necessarily can answer, but this is just something that I've been thinking about, again, applying that equity lens to, have we had the right people in the right places to be centered in making decisions as we're, trying to respond to a crisis situation. I'm not sure.
And just coming up with, I think the power and the importance is having those questions in your mind as we go through the work that we do, being mindful of applying that equity lens in everything that we do. So, as we are doing our work, or if we're concerned about something that impacts our students, having voice, pulling up a chair at the table, so to speak, in the best way that we possibly can, because teachers' voices are really critical in this whole process. Yeah. They need to be heard. And so, sending a note here or there, or feeling empowered to push back a little or to ask some questions. And that to me is the power of this question, whose voices are at the table. Yeah. And if your voice isn't, please pull one up. Yeah. We need to be advocates for our students and our families, especially right now when, I'll tell you something. When we were back in buildings, I always felt like I could, I have more free. I have certain freedom and connectivity with people
Yeah.
that I just don't feel like I have
I
now.
know. I
So in
know.
this changed environment, I am having to email more if I want to have a voice at the table.
Yeah.
I am pursuing that with others. I'm inviting other people to a conversation, and I would encourage people to do that. The issue really is voices at the table. Are we ensuring that our families and our students' voices are at the table? And then the question becomes, which of those families and students' voices are at the table? Are all the families at the table? Are the families of color at the table? And
Mhm.
are their voices being heard? Who can be an advocate for these families? Do I know anyone who might be an advocate for these families?
Yeah.
Can they be my sounding board? Can I get some information from them? I do that regularly because, I'm not as connected. Being an administrator it seems like when I felt more connected when I was a teacher and a staff assistant. And then as I started to progress through the ranks in education and I became more and more distanced from immediate contact with my
Mhm.
students, I really started to have to count more on people who still were right there with students.
Yeah.
So teachers' voice is really important. Teachers of color, their voice is
Mhm.
important. People who work with our families, like our translators and interpreters,
Yeah.
are people who work for title programs, like our migrant program, ELL program, tapping on them, and saying, hey, what are you hearing? Give me some ideas on how I can get some voices from communities of color at the table. Being willing to be a little vulnerable around that, so that you can hear those voices.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not applying that, that at the state level that that our leaders aren't listening to those diverse voices, but we ask these questions and we wonder, do we have the right people? And we need to keep asking. Um, so I talked a little bit about the grief that special educators have around the loss of opportunities.
Yeah.
We consider inclusion a moral imperative for our students, and this question had me reflecting on just the fact that bringing students under one roof, in school kind of lent the illusion that we were leveling the playing field for students. And so I think this situation again has highlighted that it was never level. We always had unequal opportunities. So I want to respect your time, so I'm going to move on to the next question because this is one I'm really curious for you
I know.
to.
You and I were
talked about.
We were joking earlier that it seems like with this new environment, we seem to be running, those back-to-back meetings get shorted, so I'm looking at my next one going, oh no, they're going to be shorted too. Sorry about that.
I know. Well, we'll wrap this up, and we'd always intended this to be a short conversation, even though this could be, we could talk for the next couple of hours, and you and I have had these types of conversations, but maybe 1 or 2 minutes to talk about what can educators do about it. What should we be thinking about, as we move forward? You and I talked about leveraging the strengths of our families and their communities. What are a couple of ideas that you have, or tips or articles or things that people can do to go deeper into this next step into action?
Yeah, for me, I've done a lot of thinking about what can we do about it. We've talked a little bit about that already, especially around finding ways to be an advocate, to stand for your students and try to poke around and see what you can learn to advocate for them. But the thing that keeps resonating with me, and this kind of addresses your what's next also, is currently we're able to see how our children is, and I'm going to talk about children of color, our children who live in poverty, especially, how they're being left behind. The gaps are getting greater and greater. We already had huge disparities, barriers, and gaps around learning and opportunities to be successful, right? For our children of color and for children with disabilities. But those gaps, let's be honest, they're not getting shorter. They're not getting smaller. They're getting larger, especially as we have, we are leaving children behind in this rush to go online.
Yeah.
So what? So what can we do about that?
Mm-hmm.
What can I do about that? I think, again, be mindful that that's happening. And so when this, which I hope will be soon, when this gets to the point where we're back in the buildings, I want to remember this conversation. I want everyone to remember that, we did create more gaps. It was clearly no one's fault. It was the condition of the pandemic, but it still happened. We're educators now. Conversations later on around budget, around allocation of time, around resources, around differentiating instruction, around all of those things that impact kids so significantly. When they come up, I want people to have in their heads, in their minds, that image of those students. Remember that what's the distinction between equity and equality? Looking at over the fence with the boxes. How some students need a couple more boxes just to be able to see up over that fence.
Yeah.
I want people to remember that, so that if we do get out of this situation, and we're going to have some hard conversations, that we stand with that principle in our heads and in our hearts, that you know, these kids are going to need some extra resources and extra support.
Yeah. And not only that, can we tear down that fence?
Right on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, Marisol, I thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. And like I said, this was too short, but we'll put links in the resources section. So people who find their way to this page through our special ed distance learning can do some additional learning and reading. And I know I am happy to have further conversations with people who want to reach out to me and talk through some of these things. I'm learning alongside everybody, and I know you are too, willing to talk and share what you know. So thank you.
And thank you. It was a pleasure. And I just want to, before I leave, say thank you to all the teachers who are out there. My son's a teacher too. I was a teacher for many years.
Yeah.
I know, and I feel it too. And I just want you to know that I have a lot of pride in what you're doing, and I believe in you strongly, and just keep up that good fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. There we go. It stopped.